Тогда, уважаемые коллеги, я хочу слово предоставить доктору Джонатану Гроссу. Джонатан Гросс является научным сотрудником Департамента культуры, средств массовой информации и креативных индустрий Королевского колледжа Лондона. В центре исследований господина Джонатана Гросса находятся вопросы о роли государства в культуре и роли культуры в процветании человека. На сегодняшний день Джонатан Гросс является автором ряда работ по культурным преобразованиям. И сейчас, уважаемый господин Джонатан Гросс выступит на тематику «Предпосылки креативных индустрий. История определений и классификаций». Пожалуйста, слово вам.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to have the chance to speak with you all. And my role today is to provide you with some history of how the creative industries have been defined. And I hope that in thinking about where we've come from, this will help our conversations in terms of where we might be going. So what I will do is I'll mainly speak about this one very famous piece of cultural policy research and documentation, the 1998 Creative Industries Mapping document produced by the UK government. And I'll tell you about my research into that piece of policy. And then I'll move towards some future possibilities for defining and measuring the creative industries and connect that to some of the conversations that I think you're having at the moment. So the 1998 Creative Industries Mapping document produced by the UK government has been highly influential and much discussed. This is a British story which became an international story. And 20 years after the document was first created, defining the creative industries for the first time, I conducted some oral history research into how it was created. And I was asking three questions. Why was this document written? How was it written? And what were the consequences? And so to answer those questions, I interviewed the politicians, civil servants, advisors, creative industries leaders who were involved in writing this document. And then I held the event that you can see photographed here, a witness seminar in which some of the key players came together to discuss that history. So I'll take you through my findings against those three questions and draw out some of the implications for our conversations today. So why was the Creative Industries Mapping document written? Lots of commentary on this document has connected it to the overall project that the Labour Party was undertaking when it came to power in the UK in 1997. So the Conservative Party had been in power for 18 years, and then Tony Blair, as the leader of the Labour Party, won the election in 1997, and it was seen as a new modern era in British politics with a young Prime Minister who was interested in connecting his political project to ideas of creativity. So this is a very famous photograph of Tony Blair meeting Noel Gallagher from Oasis, the pop band, at Downing Street. And this is seen as an emblem of the new modern party that Labour was. And this is reflected in how Tony Blair changed the ministries within his government. So in 1992, the Conservative Party had set up a new ministry, the Department for National Heritage, but Tony Blair expanded the department to be called the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And he created a creative industries task force. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And the first minister or Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport was Chris Smith, who you can see pictured here. And he published a book within a year of coming into office called Creative Britain. So in all of these ways, the Labour Party's new project was associated with creativity, with modernity, with being a young party trying to do something new in British politics. But a question that arose in my research was, how central to the New Labour modernisation project were the creative industries really? And I'll say something about why I think that's significant at the end, because I think it relates to the question of how policy change happens to support the creative industries. So on the one hand, the creative industries look like they're central to what this new government was all about. But on the other hand, my research shows that it was actually a small group of people influential in driving the agenda of the creative industries. And two of those people are on your screen now. One of them at the bottom is John Newbigin, who some of you I think know well. He's central to the British Council's work on the creative economy. And in the 1990s, before Labour came to power, he worked closely with David Putnam, also photographed here, who was a very successful film producer who then became involved with the Labour Party. And he describes how in the mid-90s, before Labour came to power, he says the following: I was basically funding an informal creative industries think tank. I think that what we contributed was a bit of coherence. We actually got them, the policymakers, to see the arts, or what we then termed the creative industries, because that was the big shift, moving the words from the arts to the creative industries. We got them to see it as a potential economic driver, not simply as a nice to have. So there are two important points to make here. One is that the language really mattered. The change of language was part of showing politicians and decision makers that here was a new sector of the economy, the creative industries. And secondly, that this was a small group of people who were coming up with these ideas, which then got taken up within government. And so when the Labour Party won the election, the Creative Industries Task Force was set up. And what it was seeking to do was to give visibility to the creative industries as an emerging sector of the economy, to identify barriers to future growth within this area of economic activity, and to bring key players together to recognize themselves as part of a sector in a new way. So that included executives from film, fashion, publishing, music, etc., but also ministers and civil servants from a wide range of government departments. So not only the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, but also education, trade and industry, environment and transport, the Foreign Ministry, the ministries for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and also the Finance Ministry, the Treasury. And the important point to make here is to ask the question, who needs to be involved in developing creative industries policy? Which range of policy responsibilities matter in this space? So in my next two slides, I have some quite long quotations, but I promise at the end of the long quotations, but they're helpful in giving you a sense of this history from the people who were directly involved. So here, David Putnam is explaining why the Creative Industries Task Force decided it needed to map the creative industries for the first time. So he says, it emerged from the fact that we found ourselves desperately ignorant. We had two problems. How should you define the creative economy? And then trying to put a number on actually what it was worth. We needed a starting point. We needed to know what we were talking about. We agreed at the time that we do a second one in 5 years. We needed a direction of travel. We needed to know where we were in order to be sure where we were going and whether we were heading in the right direction. Once you defined a sector, once you've mapped out what its growth is, then that allows you to start prioritizing different areas of policy development. And I want to make two observations about what David Putnam says here. The first is that he uses the phrase creative economy rather than creative industries. We'll discuss later there's a cluster of terms: creative industries, creative economy, cultural industries, which are closely related but different. And actually the differences between them matter quite a lot. And we might discuss that further. But the second point is that being able to tell a story of the development of the creative industries was really central to why it was important to have a definition and a measurement. Being able to say, this is what the creative industries looked like in 1998. This is what they look like 5 years later. You can show a growth, a story, which will catch the attention of policymakers. So I've given you a sense of why this document was written, which defined and measured the creative industries for the first time. But how was it written? So here's the minister, Chris Smith, describing how the definition of the creative industries was developed. He says, "I sort of dreamed it up. What I was trying to do was to establish in a fairly precise form of words what it was that made these activities different. And I was also wanting to record in that definition the crucial importance of protecting intellectual property value, because that, of course, was increasingly becoming a big issue. That's where the economic value was enshrined, especially in a digital environment where you can transmit intellectual property in a moment across the world. Finding the right ways of establishing the remuneration path back to the creator becomes really important. So highlighting the creation of intellectual property as being at the heart of this process was, I think, very important." And there are two observations I want to make about this statement. The first is the informality of the process of defining the creative industries. So on the one hand, the definition of the creative industries that was developed here became internationally influential and very famous. On the other hand, it was a very informal process with Chris Smith and a small number of advisors really just trying to find a form of words that describe this area of activity. And the second observation to make is that intellectual property is part of this definition. So two further things to say. Given that the process of defining the creative industries was very informal, this tells us something about why the definition has continued to be developed, and I would argue will continue to be developed. And the second thing to raise is intellectual property still at the heart of what we understand the creative industries to be, or does it go beyond intellectual property in significant ways? So here's the famous definition from the 1998 mapping document. The creative industries are those industries which have their origin in individual creativity, skill, and talent, and which have a potential for wealth and job creation through the generation and exploitation of intellectual property. And 13 subsectors were identified within the creative industries listed below: advertising, arts and tech, antiques, architecture, crafts, design, fashion, film, leisure software, music, performing arts, publishing, software, TV, and radio. So that was how the creative industries were defined. It's important to say something about how the data was collected to know the size and shape of these areas of economic activity. I've read some academic writing about this process, which refers to the statisticians in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. But there were no statisticians within that ministry. It was a very small department with very few resources. And actually, the original research was undertaken for free by a company called Spectrum Strategy Consulting, the director of which sat on the Creative Industries Task Force, Janice Hughes, a business analyst. So she and her team did desk research, seeing what publicly available data was available to map these areas of activity. And then they conducted interviews with trade associations and creative industries leaders in order to find out if there was any other data that could be added to the publicly available data, and also to identify blockages that policy could try to respond to in enabling growth for these areas. So one of the things that emerged from my research was a picture of very uneven availability of data in 1998. So for example, the publishing sector had very good data, whereas other areas like video games, there was very little understanding of what that area of activity looked like. And as Janice Hughes says, there was just big holes. There were big holes in GDP because the data wasn't properly collected. So many of my research participants would say, we used the phrase mapping quite deliberately because this was uncharted territory that we were mapping for the first time. And we knew the research wasn't perfect, but it was the first attempt. And when we did the research again for the second time in 2001, there was more resource available to do the research more accurately. So I'll just say something brief about what the consequences were of the mapping document. So my research participants said the consequences were everything and nothing. The document was influential beyond the wildest dreams of those who had developed it. It went around the world, and the creative industries became something that many governments were interested in. However, the consequences were very limited in the UK in terms of the policy processes that were put in place to support the creative industries. This is what my research participants felt. So one civil servant said that the document allowed us to have a core script for government, a set of things that we could take to different decision makers and say, this is what the creative industries are, this is why they matter. But the finance ministry, the treasury, was very slow to become interested in this area. Similarly, the Department of Education was very slow to become interested in this area. Local authorities and regional development agencies were more immediately interested. But overall, those people involved in the Creative Industries Task Force have been disappointed that there wasn't more uptake of interest in the creative industries within UK political life. They do say, however, that after the second mapping in 2001, where you could show the growth of the sector, there was more recognition. But although organizations like the Creative Industries Federation, the Creative Industries Council, and Nesta continue to support and champion the creative industries, there's much more progress that could be made in supporting the creative industries through education policy, through access to finance, etc., etc. So in the last 3 or so minutes, I'm just going to say a word about what has happened since and connect that to the conversations that you might be having. So many of you will be familiar with subsequent models of the creative industries, including this one developed by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which builds on the 1998 definition, but it expands it in 1 or 2 directions, including, for example, more of an emphasis on heritage and also going beyond intellectual property to a certain degree, but it's quite close in its foundations to the 1998 definition. And perhaps more significantly, the expansion of the creative industries into a wider sense of the creative economy. And this is sometimes referred to as the trident model of the creative economy, which importantly recognizes that there are creative occupations outside of the creative industries. So the creative economy constitutes 2 kinds of jobs within the creative industries: creative jobs within the creative industries, non-creative jobs within the creative industries, but also creative jobs outside of the creative industries. So for example, you might be a graphic designer who works for an oil company. So you're still part of the creative economy, even though you're not in the creative industries. And the point that I want to make is that the difficulties of measuring the size of the creative industries continue, because creativity is not neatly boxed within conventional sectors. And in a sense, this has been the whole history of the attempt to define the creative industries, that traditional industrial era statistical modeling fails to capture the economic dynamics of services and information based on creativity. So it's inherently really hard to do this kind of economic mapping. On the other hand, models of creative industries, they have consequences for the size of the creative industries and for the policy that follows from having measured and mapped them. So before I reach my very brief conclusions, I just want to point to the fact that another way in which this conversation is developing is expanding our notions of economic success. So not only GDP and jobs as our indicators of when the economy is doing well. Part of my research uses the capability approach to economic development that Amartya Sen developed, which really says that prosperity isn't only about money in your pocket, it's about the range of things that you can do in your life. Do you have access to education? Do you have political rights? Do you have a rich range of activities that you can engage with? So some of my current work in a project called Developing Inclusive and Sustainable Creative Economies is experimenting in how you could develop a new indicator for the creative economy, which has a multi-dimensional capabilities index, which is beyond monetary contribution and jobs. And perhaps we could have a conversation about that later. But I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to conclude by saying 4 things. My research on the history of the creative industry's definition shows that we need to be thinking about the multiple scales that were involved in bringing about this new definition. So the creative industries came about as a definition because the economy was changing, because creativity and knowledge and information was becoming more important. But on the other hand, it was a small group of people who really drove this policy process. So we can think about the implications of that for Central Asia. The economy might be changing, but you also have to take responsibility for naming and defining and measuring that change. There continue to be conceptual challenges because creativity is located in lots of different parts of the economy, and creativity is in itself difficult to define. So that means that the process of defining creative industries is ongoing. Technical challenges remain because the quality of data can be very varied. But the point that I want to end on is to say that the purpose of defining and measuring the creative industries really matters. So who is the information for will have an effect on how you define and measure, as well as the question, what does success look like? Is success GDP growth and jobs, or does success involve other things as well? So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the work that you're doing together and hearing how it connects back to this history that I've described.
Спасибо большое, доктор Джонатан Гросс. Очень полезная презентация. Действительно, вопросы понятийного аппарата, да, определения самого понятия креативных индустрий, что такое креативные индустрии на современном этапе развития, что такое креативная экономика. Для меня, например, как для представителя государственного органа, это понятийный аппарат, он очень важен, потому что прежде чем принимать какие-то нормативно-правовые акты, вот, например, мы сейчас в Кыргызстане хотим, да, принять либо это закон, либо нормативно-правовой акт о поддержке института, да, креативных индустрий, но тогда нужны понятийные вещи, которые будут внедрены в оборот, в том числе в статданные, и которым будут пользоваться как и сами представители этого института, так и государственные, муниципальные служащие и так далее. Вопрос измерений креативных индустрий, да, вот вы правильно сказали, индикаторы для развития к экономике. Вот, к сожалению, как бы мы ни говорили, мы в Кыргызстане хотим делать успехи в этом направлении, но, к сожалению, в единственном исследовании, которое было вот в прошлом году, я выше говорила о том, что рабочая группа провела анализ, у нас в Кыргызстане работает свыше 13 секторов креативных индустрий, и оказалось, что их вклад в экономику менее чем 1%. Здесь, наверное, больше вопрос именно в индикаторах. именно в средствах по измерению, потому что мы уверены, что вклад их очень огромный, вклад большой, и в будущем он будет усиляться, в будущем он будет повышаться. Но тем не менее и понятийный аппарат, внедрение новых методик измерения роста креативных индустрий, оно, наверное, необходимо, оно актуально не только для Кыргызстана, но в целом и для центральноазиатских стран. Большое спасибо, была замечательная презентация.